say
I'm
something?
re-
I'm with
I'm-
it without my glasses because I don't really need to read anything, and I don't know
No.
what this is doing to your.
better with
I'm
it?
fine with your glasses. The glasses are fine. They're not reflecting anything, so we're good. And so I'm recording the video now, so we are live. I should be good. Is it silent? So okay, yeah. So I guess we should start it with Larry, and then just have a conversation. But what I wanted to just to facilitate is maybe we could do it chronological. That way, have a start and a finish, and then kind of everything that kind of ties into Larry with this whole journey, and especially the labor camps, because I don't find a lot of material about the labor camps. So if you can be as visual, as descriptive as possible, or especially special stories, like your own personal stories about the labor camps and what it was like playing around or just having fun in there.
Let me start off. What I'll do then is start off at the Lucas camp where I grew up, and I was born in Delano and all that.
Lucas.
And I grew up on that ranch. So I'll start about that, and I think the segue between the camp to Larry will be how the foreman negotiated their crew's pay, and each foreman did that separately. So you would never quite know what we at Lucas or what Zaninovich might have, or Jake Cesar might have, or Karatan might have.
Or like for instance, the first time we met Larry.
Yeah, and then we'll get to that. But the reason for Larry coming and AWOC coming was there's some disparity in that process. Okay, because each camp might have a slightly different pay because of who the foreman was and the relationship to the grower. And it's also an issue of some foremen had, and my dad's not the only one, but there were some foremen who'd been in the business so long, had known grapes for so long, and at a level that talked more than just production and harvesting grapes. It was everything about grapes, how to plant a grape vine, what soil a grapevine is planted in, whether a grape needed to have grafting of other types of grapes onto the main vine because you needed other fruit, because the soil condition for that grape is better here, but you need a different variety of grapes, so you do some grafting. That whole process was in discussion between the foreman typically and the growers. The growers own the plants, but who are they going to go to say, we planted these 4 vines to try to test them, which one is better, is the foreman, because they're the ones that planted them. They know what happened when it was started. So like my dad and other foremen, they were really the heart of the process because they were the key to the grower, but they were also the key for the workers. And the relationships were such that there were some people that worked for my dad for over 50 years with no break. They stayed with my dad no matter where we worked for that length of time. They came to America, they worked together as friends. My dad became a foreman, they worked with him as a foreman, and then they retired. And one manong, Mariano Zamora, when he retired, he moved into our house. And as a matter of fact, I didn't even know he wasn't my grandfather till I was 14. I thought he was my grandfather because he had the first name just like my dad. But I applied to the seminary for the Franciscan priesthood, and you have to fill out all these papers. Your family background, and your birth certificates and marriage certificates. And my dad's filling out the paperwork, and he writes Pablo Armington and San Fabian Pangasinan. And I said, who's this? And my dad said, that's your grandpa. I said, well, who's Tata? He's Mariano. He said, well, he's not related to us. And for the first time I realized I'd be calling him Tata, or like a grandfather kind of perspective, out of absolute respect of how he came to our family. And so that kind of relationship, that key relationship, was not the kind of relationship you had in the Mexican worker situation. They were more migrant by this point. They traveled crops, and then their homes were some in the area, but some from Texas, some from Mexico. And so they would go and get a job with whoever they could find, or if they could find someone they liked working for, they might come back every year. So we had Mexican workers from Texas and Mexico that worked for us every harvest season, every year for perhaps 20 years. So there was a mixture of Mexican workers, Filipino workers. We even had Eskimo workers that worked for us who were looking for jobs down here, and they had some background. So that kind of focus of the foreman's relationship was key to the organizing of Filipino farm workers, because if you did not get the foreman to go along with AWOC, the workers would never sign it. And so it's the 20 plus foremen that were in those meetings that when they stood up to talk, the workers really listened, because typically they'd say, "What do you think, boss? What do you think, Mang Bob," right? And then we would talk at the camp, or we would talk in meetings or at the house or after the AWOC meeting. And my dad was of the firm conviction that we were making about $1 an hour at that point, plus so much per box during harvest season. But we didn't have any benefits. You got sick. And you might apply for welfare, but there wasn't any benefits. If you got injured, there were no benefits for that either. At this point, that were really helpful for us. So we needed that, and more Filipinos after the war were now establishing families. So the children had needs, the family needed to be more settled, they needed more money than they had to before as single manongs. So it would benefit the manongs plus the families. But the process of getting to that point in the Philippine community was a difficult process. We talk about it in terms of there were some meetings, they voted, everybody voted, go ahead, let's do the strike started, and 5 years later we signed a contract. That's the easy story. The hard story is the absolutely grueling, hard, gut-wrenching effect on people's lives, and them having to figure out in those meetings, are we going to do this or not? And am I going to lose my house that I've worked, come to America with nothing, started with nothing, saved up enough, sent money to the Philippines to family, and then got married and had kids, and now I'm going to lose it all. And then I start over just like I did 25 years ago. And so the Filipinos figured out a way to do something different. Since the strike was primarily in Delano, and grapes in California are a seasonal harvested crop. They start in Coachella, that's the hottest part of the year in June. They ripen there first, and then goes to Arvin and Bakersfield, then Delano, then Fresno, then Lodi. So it goes up the state of California. What we decided we would do, because we didn't know how long the strike would start, and because the manongs had relationships with growers throughout the state of California, long-standing relationships, years ago, that they would get jobs with companies who were in the strike, manongs who were in the strike, and would go and get jobs, and strikers would come and work. So they could work 2-3 weeks. And this was Larry and Philip and my dad and others talking about how we would arrange this as sort of a vehicle to try to put money in workers' pockets, both Mexican and Filipino. This wasn't just Filipinos. And then they would come back after 2 or 3 weeks working, pay their mortgage, and go on the picket line for a week. So they could still be in the union, still be paying their dues, still be parting in this, but not lose, if they could, not lose what they had. Plus, there were food being brought in, clothes being brought in, and it really became a process of people coalescing. But I think the key part of Larry was you sometimes need somebody who is a distinct voice, not one of your own, from the town that everyone knows, to come in and say, I've done it, I've worked all the fields, I've worked the canneries, I've done this, and we've organized. We struck in Seattle, we struck in Oakland, we struck in Salinas, and the reasons we didn't win there were X, Y, and Z. But the reason we can win in Delano is something entirely different. We own this town in terms of labor. The growers really, really need us. In a lot of places where it's just really migrant work and you're just harvesting a head of lettuce, well, it takes somebody who knows it's machine planted. And then when you harvest it, if it's hand harvested, they have machines that do it now, but sometimes they were hand harvested, is to be able to cut it and put it on a conveyor belt and let it get wrapped and then you sell it, right? So it's just a matter of a technique of weeding or harvesting or that. Grapes are entirely different. They have to be treated carefully throughout the entire year cycle.
It's like cosmetic.
It is cosmetic. Well, it is cosmetic. But what you're doing in every step along the way, from the wintertime when you're pruning, all the way to the summertime when you're harvesting, then you have a short dormant period, then you go to pruning again. Each of those steps will wind up at the end with a great harvest of grapes. But if you don't do those steps correctly, the crop isn't quality, and therefore the growers don't get the price that the growers in Delano were used to getting, and that's why it's called the grape capital of the world. The highest market price, except for Coachella. Coachella is because it starts the season. They have a high price. We would be able to maintain a high price in Delano because of the quality of the fruit. Why do we have the quality of the fruit? The manongs. So it was a really kind of a unique situation. We had the organizer of organizers, the person that knew what it took to make something work if the conditions were right. However, our problem, as you know, was we didn't have enough Filipinos in the community in terms of the entire labor pool to be able to make the strike effective over time. And if we didn't have Cesar and them come in, and if workers were coming over from Mexico and jumping the picket line, the strike would be over. So it took that kind of process, and I think Larry was really the key part of bringing that coalition together within the Filipino community first, and then within the Filipino and Mexican community second. And I don't think anybody in Delano could have done that.
So when was the first time you met him? You remember?
You know, the first time I met him was probably in the spring of that same year. The Filipino way of doing things is not to set up a formal meeting to introduce somebody new to town and introduce them in the front of a meeting and show their credentials and give you their biography and hand it out, and then everybody asks questions. The Filipino way to do that is to take somebody and take over to somebody's house and have dinner and sit down and pala. And then you need to talk. You need to sort of establish credentials by way of relationship. My dad and others were part of that. They had known of Larry. My dad, as was involved with strikes in the 30s, with other union organizing, and against certain unions like Teamsters. So my dad had been around that, but it had never been really very successful. But he'd known Larry, I think. I don't believe I ever really asked my dad this directly. But I remember when I was around them, they would talk about the old days. And you don't do that unless you've known somebody that you've been around. So I have a feeling they've known each other, and the vehicle of knowing people in the community is your first step. And then they went around, and I think what happened was they went around and spoke with the phone first, because that would be the key to speaking with the workers about what the idea was. That's the time the growers making money. I mean, you work all year paying money to workers to do all the production of tipping and thinning and throwing vines and girdling and all the steps you take. But the time you make your money is when you sell your grapes. So the time you would strike is when you sell your grapes. And that was coming up in September, because June in Coachella, July, early August in Arbor, and Delano is September. So I think they were really focusing on doing it that year. And I remember meeting because they would come to the house and sit at the table and talk. That's the first time I remember meeting him. I didn't know his kids at that point until after the strike started, and then all the kids were together.
Well, what were your memories of the camp, of the labor camp? Was he there at the labor camp, or?
I remember him coming to the camp, and the labor camps are typically built on county roads. So you drive right off a county road into a parking spot, a dirt spot, or into a driveway with parking. And there are no fences around camps. They're open, and you don't have to have a grower's permission to go into a camp. You kind of had to have the foreman's permission to come into the camp because it's his crew. So if a person were coming to, like, say, the Lucas camp, the first person they'd want to meet would be my dad. And we had a guy that used to come for years. He had the best job, best business. I don't think he had an office, but his best business, he was a chiropractor. And he would come on Sundays. We'd have him lined up outside a room, and he'd come and tweak people's backs and leg and shoulder and get them ready for another week's work. And he got paid cash. So I don't know if he ever paid taxes on whatever he got paid from the workers. But I always thought after that, what a great job for a chiropractor to come and help people feel better at the end of a work week. But he had to come in. I remember him coming in and asking my dad what he was doing, and my dad had to sort of ask him, what kind of doctor are you? And he had to show his credentials on that, what chiropractic meant, because the other thing my dad didn't want to do is have some quack come in and hurt people. So I have a feeling he may have done something helping my dad with the shoulder, something just to show him what it is. And my dad said that's okay, as long as you don't charge too much. And we had those kinds of things happening. Right? So I have a feeling Larry probably called ahead of time, and I'm coming, and they met in town, and then he would make his rounds, and Dad would introduce him to his next influential people on the subfloor. We had 5 crews in the picking season. A crew from the camp, and 4 other crews that were from Delano, early Martin area, including people from other areas in Mexico. And between 70 and 90 workers per crew. Camp crews 100. We had probably 500 people working for us in the summertime. So in order for the word to kind of go through you have to meet all the subforemen. And of course my dad thought it was a good idea, the foreman would probably go along with it. But they would of course have their meetings with my dad privately and say, okay boss, what are we doing here and why, And many of the subforemen that worked for my dad were his subforemen for 30 years with us. So the relationships were long standing. But I do remember coming to the camp, and I do remember him making a presentation sometime in the summer of that year. It would probably have been on a Sunday because everybody works 6 days a week. And I remember part of it in the sense of him talking about unionization in the past and how that Filipinos have been doing this before, but why it had never been so successful because of problems. Anti-laws that we had, Filipino laws and anti-Asian laws and the things that were going on. He may or may not have talked about Watsonville and the riots that occurred there, but I think he needed to present sort of this historical view that only Larry can do well, and to say that you're part of something bigger than just here. It's coming from the past, but it's something to help you today, and this is something we want to try to talk to you about. But it takes several times of doing that. You don't convince Filipinos to turn their lives upside down in one meeting. It takes time to discuss it, have them go and talk about it, come back and ask you 5 questions. So a lot of that happened, and there's a lot of camps in Delano. So I'm sure Larry made the rounds a lot that summer before they even had the meetings before September. Regarding the camp, I grew up on a camp. I didn't grow up in town. I had a brother that died in the Korean War the same year I was born, and it's from his government insurance. I think it was $15,000, something in that range, that we made a deposit and built a house in Delano. But until then, we just lived in the camp. We had an apartment. But from Sunday night till Saturday night, we lived at the camp. And then Saturday night, after cooking was over and the kitchen was clean, go to Delano, spend Saturday night, go to church Sunday morning, spend the day in Delano, and go back to the camp late Sunday. So we had a 1-day house and a 6-day camp. We had a lot of manongs. We had a lot of younger Filipinos that worked for us, even in the 50s and 60s that I remember, and with their fathers coming over after the war. And then we had families coming where the families were waiting to come, but the fathers needed to come and earn some money to bring them, right? And we had over 100 Filipinos that were there. It ranged age 17 to 60 at that time. And there was this really, really wonderful sense of respect. Everybody had to go to town to do their laundry, or we had one washing machine at the camp, and we had a long clothesline. And I can remember some of the younger Pinoys going up to an elderly mom, just respect, saying, I'm going to do my laundry if you want me to do yours. Because they're old, they've been working hard, and now they have to go do laundry. And they didn't ask to get paid, they just said, I'm going to help, can I do yours? And the mom would say, oh sure, and then here's some money, to help you. And go to town, right? Go to town. And so there was this kind of fatherly son kind of relationship that was prevalent. Then we had people in town that worked for us all year long. And so we had a lot of dances, parties at the camp, and people came from everywhere. Because we would sometimes do roasts and bury a hog that was rice. And sometimes we'd roast a whole lechon, you know. We had cockfights every 2 to 3 weeks.
So the manong they raised the cocks.
They did.
Yeah.
And you know, it's kind of a Filipino tradition, you know, a cultural tradition, transferred to the United States. We probably had around 100, maybe a little more, chicken coops, one for each, you know, because they don't really like living together after they're not chicks anymore. And so we had cockfights, and there would be 400 or 500 people at a cockfight. And some people came from Texas, Arizona, New Mexico for a cockfight, and there would be thousands upon thousands of dollars on these fights. You know? And next door to us in Delano on 15th Avenue was an elderly Filipino who had injured himself somewhere along the way and could no longer work in the fields. He was the main supplier of knives for cockfights in Southern California. That's all I remember, people coming up and them shipping knives over other states. But I think it was either his cousin or relative that used to make a knife holder made of leather that you could tie so you could put several knives together and then tie it so you don't get hurt, right? You can't carry a knife around. So that process, you know, kind of went on there too. My mother was the camp cook. Unusual. She's from Oklahoma, but she learned all the dishes from my dad and my Uncle Tony, who later became the Agbayani village cook. And she was the camp cook for over 25 years, working 6 days a week. So the first time I woke up every morning was 3 o'clock. Because I would be awakened in our little apartment by them getting up to go cook. You know, so they started at 3, and then everyone was in the field by 6:15. And so the camp was really this place where you had a social life, you had a place that was your home. Our camp had 2 in a room with walls and a window and an air conditioning duct. So it was kind of private, although we had a kind of open shower area and toilet area with dividers and doors. So in that sense, it's a little bit living in an apartment, in a fraternity house, so to speak. But the rooms were unusual in that the rooms were divided into 2. And so there was room for a closet, and tables, and beds, and we had an air conditioning thing. So I call it air conditioning. It's really a swamp cooler, which is you know what we used in the old days because nobody had air conditioning. So everybody had their kind of privacy, which was really kind of nice. And another thing that was kind of special, we didn't have insurance. If you got sick, you had to go to the doctor and pay for your doctor bill. Sometimes people couldn't afford it. They'd send money to the Philippines or some other need. And over those 50 years, my dad loaned a lot of money out or gifts to people for baby born, somebody was sick or something. And not a whole lot got paid back entirely. Some got paid back entirely, but not everything. And I remember, and I sent his binder to the University of Washington about 25 years ago for them to put in the archive. It had all of those receipts. It showed how much somebody had paid, and then when it was fully paid, it was 0, you know. But I thought somebody should keep that up here instead of down here. My dad would take him if he could, or my mother would take him to the doctor whenever needed, or the hospital. And then they would get released. We'd visit them while they're there, get released. And sometimes my dad would wind up paying the bill, and then they would pay my dad back. And then my mother would have to cook some special diet for a week, 2 days, 5 days, whatever. So my mother's cooking 100 meals for Filipinos, plus this doctor's diet for one person, and would take it to the room and help them so to make sure they got, you know, and that kind of tradition that my mother learned from Oklahoma, kind of motherly mentality, fits really well with the Filipino tradition of caring for one another. So her being American fit really well into our culture. And when she passed away, there were probably about 2,000 people at the funeral.
Well, what year was that?
1975 of cancer. There were a lot of Filipinos that came up to me because my dad asked me to do the eulogy. That came up to me, they're older than me, that worked for us, that cried on my shoulder and said, I've lost my mother. You know? But that's what the camp was. It was home. You know? So when you lose that, when all of a sudden it's no longer there, what do? You know, and that's the consequence of the strike, is if you're not working for the company's not going to provide you a place to live. And the process of leaving the camp was difficult too, because we weren't working, and after a while, then they start turning off the electricity and the gas and the water. So how do you survive without those amenities? We did for a little while longer, so we had some water supply, and we dug and we cooked and we dug pits and grape stakes, and we barbecued for a while, a few days. Then we decided, okay, we have to leave. And then you have all those thousands of Filipinos, manongs, trying to find a place somewhere to live until they can do something. And so overnight we had like 75 people living in our house. In the garage, in the driveway, in the backyard, in the house, everywhere. But that's what you do until they can find a place. So that ended abruptly when the strike started. So that life that I had grown used to ended. And now we knew we were in this for the hardcore. Okay, this is going to happen. And so now when they went to work elsewhere, my dad contacted everyone and said, I'm going to Coachella, or I'm going to Arvin to work at such and such. I'm starting on this day. If you want to come by the house, I'll put you on the list. And you would come and work, and then you'd live at the camp. Or, it's like in Arvin, which is 65 miles away, you drove every day to Arvin in the fog, the Central Valley fog, and back to Delano. In the summertime, we drove in picking season, so that means you would go home at 5 or 6 at night, eat dinner, go to sleep, and leave Delano at 3:34 the next morning to get to the field in time to start working. And we did that for 5 years. But that's that process, that struggle, that hard work. With regard to Larry, the word I keep using it with regard to him was how he was able to coalesce things. The other thing that's common among Filipino organizations is sometimes, unless you have somebody who's really going to put a structure to it, we can talk about things forever until a decision has to be made. And he kind of brought things quickly to a head, that we have to really make this, either do it now or we're not going to do it. And the first meeting we had that I went to with my dad was not a defining meeting in terms of let's do the strike. There were not a lot of people at that first meeting a couple of weeks before that said, yeah, okay, let's strike. Okay, we're going to do this. And as a matter of fact, I recall somewhere Larry saying, well, if you're not going to go along with this, if you're not going to support it, then go back to work. This isn't going to happen. But it took that meeting and then the time in between for people to do that going around and around again and finding those people, because there's somebody somewhere at each camp who's still holding out, still not sure, that you have to talk to. And once you talk to them and they say yes, everybody will fall in line behind them. And it may be one person with about 15 or 20 other people that they trust because maybe they're from the same town. And this manong came here first. And so for them to agree as a group to go, they have to follow the elder of that community from the Philippines position. And that underlying social relationship, no one else knew about. It would have been from San Esteban, and they're all, close. Well, maybe that individual from San Esteban needed more time to discuss and look at the issues, and if they're agreeable, then he says, okay, this is what we think we can do, and then everyone will follow. It's like the foreman with the crew, then you have these sub-foremen with the crew, but you also have these unknown people that are very influential because of other relationships. So it takes time.
And it's also a matter of trust.
It is a matter of trust, because what you're telling people is, if we do this, you're putting everything on the line. This isn't, well, if you don't really want to do this, you can go to LA tomorrow and get another job and start in LA doing something else. A lot of these people, especially the elders, have no other skills. I mean, they have the best skills of what they're doing, but they don't, some of them washed dishes in the 20s, or they worked in Sacramento or San Francisco doing something menial, but they're not willing to go back and try doing that, and pick up their life again. And in others, they came to Delano because they know somebody here, or there's a relative already here, or they feel uncomfortable going to a large city, so they go where there's kind of a community, and it's hard for them to pick up and leave. So you're asking people to take a chance on something that could utterly destroy their future. And not everyone kept their home. Some people didn't get enough work, couldn't, for the most part, I think people were able to make it through.
Well, I'm just going through, see if you remember certain things from, events that were recorded by journalists.
Is this what you wanted?
Yeah, no,
Oh,
this is
okay.
great. This is
Okay,
great. It's great because it's really your personal stuff. But I just want to see
Sure.
if, you probably have an idea of what happened. So the next thing I remember is the consul, the Philippine consulate telling Filipinos to quit the strike. Do you remember anything?
I'm not sure when that exactly happened. Do you have a date?
October 5, 1965. So this is about
Right, within a month.
Within a month,
Within a
yeah.
month,
The consul general tells everyone to go back.
Okay. I don't remember that in particular, but I do remember something about somebody from the Philippine government making some comment that we should end the strike. I remember somebody saying, wasn't sure if it was a consul general. And at my age of 12, I'm sure I didn't know what a consul general would have been.
Yeah.
I don't want to be disrespectful, but I'm going to kind of say how I remember everybody's attitude. It's like, who the hell are you to tell us when we should stop the strike? You don't know what we're going through. You've never been in America working in these conditions. You live in an office in San Francisco or LA and ride in a nice car with air conditioning, and you get paid a bunch of money every day. So, thanks, but no, we're not going to quit the strike. Sort of letting cat out, but Filipinos, in my perspective, tend to be the kind of people that will listen to you if you have a different perspective and you have a grounding and understanding where we're coming from. But if you come off sort of high, I'll call it that, versus us as being low, and trying to be sort of this all-powerful spokesperson, but you don't know anything about, you haven't come to Delano, you don't know who we are, you've not been here before, etc., then thank you very much, but no. And part of that is we've had a lot of consul generals over the time, because even before, at the time the Philippines was still a territory of the United States, there are still Philippine government officials that were coming to the United States to speak before the Congress with regard to immigration or other issues, right? And they would visit Delano. And the reason they would come and visit Delano is somebody would tell them, if you want to contact between LA and San Francisco, an important community in California, you go to Delano. Okay? So don't forget to go there if you want, And so we'd had those contacts before, and this, just hearing you talk about it now, doesn't sound like the same kind of individual and the same perspective I remember seeing from people who came and talked to us before. I mean, Carlos P. Romero, who had, a government official in the Philippines, but also later Secretary of the UN, came and talked to us. He was a very high figure. And I can remember hearing him talk with people saying to me how proud he was of the people that were here. How we had struggled in America when things were very harsh and helped so many families in the Philippines. So I guess approaching any Filipino community, it starts with respect. I don't think that was the perspective of that particular individual. So I don't think the community gave it any credence at that point.
You know, so let's talk about the Grape Strike. When was the first time you heard about it? You know, like
That there would be a strike
yeah,
in my house.
yeah. And how can you tell us about that scenario?
Well, I remembered, I was a normal everyday kid, so I was doing homework at night
Mm-hmm.
at the kitchen table, and they would be sitting having coffee in the same room,
Yeah.
and they're talking about a strike.
The Mano.
Larry
Larry.
and my dad and probably some other foreman,
Mm-hmm.
and who they were going to talk to, and I had never heard in the context of our community of a strike before. As far as I knew, there had never been a strike among Filipinos in history in America, because I didn't grow up in that labor process in my home, because I was born in '53. All of that took place in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And it may have occurred in Delano, but it was much earlier than when I was born. So by the time I was born, that was kind of past history, but now we were going to start something different. So I remember asking my dad, what's a strike? He says it's when you stop working so you can get more money. And I remember asking him, who's going to do this? People don't strike in Delano. In town, there are no strikes in town. And he said, well, we're talking about doing it in the fields. And I remember in my mind thinking, how does that work? Because I know that their relationships for years and years and years and years and years. And I could not in my mind figure out how a strike could begin. And from what they say, you go off, stop working, you stop doing it. I know picking's coming up because my dad's already working in Arvin before here, and Coachella had just finished. So I know grapes are coming up in a couple of months. And my mind couldn't fit what it meant to stop working. Everyone I had ever known, Filipinos always worked, all the time, unless it rained and they said no job today. Because Filipinos are very industrious people, and to make a decision to do that seemed very, very different to me. And then I just once my ear opened up, and I always used to go around with my dad to the hall for other things too, I just started listening to what they were talking about. But I didn't have any idea of how dynamic and how life-changing it was until we actually did it. Matter of fact, I'll tell you something interesting. People were saying we weren't going on strike, that everyone's going to lose their house. Well, you kind of have to, you're going to lose your house, You see, well, you're going to lose, mistake, kind of thing. You know what my dad did in 1966? We had a DeSoto, 1960, 61, 4 or 5 years ago. He went out and bought a Chrysler LeBaron Imperial. Huge, the biggest Chrysler they made. And he picked me up at St. Mary's School, where all the growers' kids went to school with me. And the growers' kids got picked up by their moms at St. Mary's School in Cadillacs. Well, I got picked up my dad in his pickup, or I got picked up with my mom in the DeSoto. And one day I'm waiting in front of the school with, I don't know, Anthony Kimpo, and maybe one of the Escalona kids, Mercy Gozi, and Filipino kids hanging out. And I'm waiting for this DeSoto to drive up, or a pickup. And there's this car sitting there, and then it honks. I don't do anything, I don't recognize this car. And then the window goes down. I heard my name. I looked, it's my dad. He yells at me, come on, I don't have much time. I said, who's that? I said, it's your dad. And I get in this huge, luxurious car. And I said to him, whose car is this? I'm thinking he borrowed it from a grower or something. He said, I just bought it in Bakersfield. I said, you just bought it? He said, yeah, Mom doesn't know about it yet. We drive home, he just bought it. And she threw a fit. She's from old school, pre-depression. We're on strike. We're having to work way out of there, and and he goes, nobody's going to tell me I'm losing my house. And so he bought that car for the sole purpose of proving that this strike was going to win, and he was going to show it by having bought this car. We never lost the house, we never lost the car. So that's kind of how the strike affected us, in terms of you sort of kind of had to go along with the process, because after a while you're just kind of in a whirlwind, and you're just in the whirlwind as it moved, until the strike was, the vote was taken and the contracts were signed.
But, because you're like your teens when you started.
12 years old.
Yeah. So did you ever wonder, because the strike was pretty long.
5 years.
Yeah, so.
Almost 6 years.
Yeah, so it reached to the point when you were in your 16, 15? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the part for me that was a little different was at 14 I applied to go to the St. Anthony Seminary, be a Franciscan. So I left home for 9 months a year when I came home for the summer.
Okay.
But the strike still affected me at the seminary in Santa Barbara. If you remember, Cesar went on several hunger strikes.
Right.
And after those hunger strikes, he had to recuperate. And the doctor said, you have to recuperate without any stress. You can't have meetings, and you can't go back to boycott this and all that. You got to get away. Well, it turns out he came to St. Anthony Seminary, and we had this small series of apartments on the grounds. We called them tortilla flats, but they were just a series of apartments, air conditioned, with, priests would come and stay for retreats. Well, we set 2 or 3 of those apartments aside for Cesar and his wife Helen and family. He stayed there for like a month. So I would go, I could go out and talk to Helen and Cesar because they're finding out what's going on, and I could send word back to my parents through them, because they had daily contact with the union, although he wasn't doing anything other than trying to recuperate. And but conversely, the other hand is my parents knew everything I was involved with at the seminary, so I couldn't keep any secrets about what I was doing and that kind of thing. So that went on, and the seminary and the Franciscan priesthood were very much a part of the strike, and the priests were involved. So for the years I was in the seminary until I was 17, almost 3 or 4 months after the end of my senior year, I left the seminary. That's where I was. But in the summertime, I would be coming home, and I was still involved with everything that we had been doing.
So when you were like at this stage, the way you look at Larry, what was your really strong impression of him? Like he's the leader, when you were like a teenager, did you really look up to him? Or how does he, how do you look at it, and how do you
Well,
view him?
Larry's kind of an icon, okay? Because he passed away kind of young, and people's memory of him is really organizing and union-oriented, because he went to do some work, some other things after the union, but then he got ill, and so things changed. But I remember Larry sitting, it's very personal, I remember Larry laughing and joking about how we were going to do this, and the growers have no idea what's coming. Because on the other hand, the growers have known us for so long, and we had been there so long, we were a known quantity. But Larry was beaming some things, and Ben Gines, and then eventually Philip and others, with their backgrounds and perspectives, and Pete Velasco. Something Delano hadn't seen before. Had seen in some ways 25 years earlier, in the 30s, but not since. And the growers certainly at this generation, because there's several generations of growers, the founders of those great vineyard companies are now older, and there are now sons and grandsons that are working in the companies. They have no experience with what had gone on before. And for example, not everyone did this, but the discussion was, do we just call a strike and picket the farm? Or do we picket the vineyard? Or do we picket the packing house? Or do we do more? And we had a lot of discussions of, should we go in and start working? And pick for hours, like maybe 3 or 4 hours, which might be equivalent of, for a crew of 100 workers, a couple of hundred, maybe 250 boxes worth of grapes, and then laid them on the ground in 105-degree heat. See, grapes are supposed to be picked, cleaned, packed on a truck, and into a cold storage as quickly as you can get them into a cold storage. Because heat affects the berries. And if you don't get them into the cold storage quickly, they'll begin to, because they're no longer living, they're not attached to the vine, they'll begin to suffer. So leaving them on the ground is going to have a negative effect on those bunches. But then when you just leave and you leave the field, now the grower has a second problem. You're on strike, but he's got hundreds of dollars, if not thousands of dollars in his field sitting on the ground and nobody to pick them. And the effort in there is to get them to say yes quickly. But we have people jumping picket lines already within a day. And those people were brought in, some in the afternoon of the first day, to pick the fruit we had left and try to save it and continue working. So we knew within that week we needed to talk to Cesar. And I remember the discussions of doing that. What's going to happen with our group once we bring them in? How big are they? What are they doing? What's their perspective? So there were some negotiations that went on. It wasn't just a, we need you, fine. And Cesar saying, well, I can start next year, not this year, we're not ready. It wasn't as easy as that. There were a lot of discussion that had to go on about what we were doing with merging two very different organizations quickly in order to get the strike to continue. But I remember within a day being in the camp, and the way our camp was, our kitchen, we had these dining tables that were kind of linoleum kind of finish, glossy with a aluminum border on it, and about this high off the ground, but we had benches on each side, but you could see 20 people on a side, maybe 22. And we had two tables like that and 3 on it, so 5 tables that size. So you could feed lots of people all at once. And I remember everybody back at the camp, and that day I went with my dad to the field on September 8th. And they had picked, and we came back to the camp. Something happened, I had to go to Delano with my mother later, so I left. And then I came back that night. The next day, of course, we didn't even go to the field, just that one day. As I recall, within a day, I think the next day, George Lucas Sr. came to the camp to talk to my dad. And he drove up into the driveway in his car and asked my dad to come out and talk to him. And I said, no, I want to talk to him in the kitchen. And in the kitchen is 7,500 workers, all drinking coffee, eating mom's apple pie. And he comes in and he says, what are we doing here? I need you to go to work. And of course, I think my dad said something like, we need to discuss, negotiate what we're going to do here, because we can't go to work without $1.40 and the other things we're asking for. He says, no, we can't do that. We're not going to do that to you. And as I recall, my dad saying, realizing they've known each other for 25 years. This isn't just somebody you work with and see only occasionally. They see each other several times every day. And it was very quickly clear that George Lucas representing the growers and my dad sort of representing the foreman and the union, standing there both sides of the window. And George was really upset. And I could see why. But they had really worked hard. The soil there was rocky and not used for much before it was a vineyard. And their families, when they came in, all of the growers, the older growers, they actually went in themselves and picked up all the rocks and boulders and all them out and plowed those fields and made them usable. So it's not as if they came in and bought a vineyard from somebody else. So a lot of really, really hard work over many, many years and starting with nothing. As a matter of fact, when my dad started with them, they didn't even have a truck to move the grapes from the field to the packing house.
What did they use?
they had to borrow
Oh.
trucks to do it. My dad had a truck and he used his, you know. And by the time the strike, they had a packing house where all the fruit we pick in a day could go into a cold storage. And by the way, when I say cold storage, people may not realize what we're talking about. A pallet of boxes is 9 boxes high, 6 stacks. So it's 81 81 boxes, 9 stacks of 9.
9 times 6 is 54.
Well, there's 6 stacks. 54 boxes.
That sounds good.
Strapped. There are 4 or 5 per truck that go in. And then you bring them in from all the fields, and within an hour and a half, they can bring them down to 40 degrees in the center box because they have to get chilled quickly.
What degree?
40 degrees above
40
freezing.
degrees?
You have to run very, very quick.
Fahrenheit?
Yeah. You have blowers that you put them in first, blows cold air through them, and then you put them in the cold storage. And inspect them. By the time we left, they had a fleet of flatbed trucks just to move grapes from the field to the packing house and move supplies from the packing house back out to the field. I think they had 9 trucks. Big flatbed bobtail trucks. And other than that, they don't use them much for the year. So companies really expanded over those 25 years into very large businesses. And I remember George saying to my dad, the Filipinos are going to have to come back and ask for their jobs. They're going to have to come back and ask for their jobs. My dad said, Filipinos will never come crawling back for a job. And we never did. That's the last time we worked for that company.
When they're, scabs that come in?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really very quickly. Because see, the Mexican organization did not have a full organization with a fully organized group of people for the whole area. They were just beginning their process of trying to organize. So a lot of people were not part of their organization and were not part of ours. And so all of a sudden they're on strike and there's jobs. Go to work. And people come from other areas to work. So it was I remember those first week or two, every day being shocking.
Why?
You didn't know what was going to happen next. People were going to jail. My parents at one point went to jail in Tulare County. And I got told by a phone call from the union legal staff when I was home from St. Mary's School, your parents are in jail, we're going to get them out on bail. It turns out that my dad was picketing, and somebody that he knew, another Filipino, came up with a truck, a pickup alongside my dad to talk with him. And we've all known each other years and years and years, and my dad leaned over to talk with him. And I don't know what their discussion was, and I don't know how it got to where it did, but at one point he took a hold of my dad's arm and then pressed on the gas and was pulling my dad with the truck. There must have been some argument at some point. Well, my mother was standing in a picket line too. She was picketing. And she sees them coming towards her with my dad sort of starting to be dragged. So she picks up a clod of dirt that had been tilled and tossed it at the truck and it hit the window. Well, the guy in the truck didn't get arrested. They arrested my mom and dad, and they arrested my mom for throwing an object at a moving vehicle. So, between that happening with them as an instance, and we had gunshots through our front window. I was told to be very careful when I was in town, not to be alone. I eventually had to leave St. Mary's School in my 7th grade year. Because there were very few, 3 or 4 of us in the entire school who were union children. And the other 2 left, I remember, and I was the only one left. And, for the most part, I didn't even have anyone that would talk with me or whatever. I'd go to class and that was it. It was like very uncomfortable, not anything physical,
Were you around when they signed the contract?
Yeah,
Were you
I was in
out
the hall.
Mhm.
We were fighting to try to get in the hall. We couldn't all fit. It was an amazing thing because some of the first people that signed were Jamara, and the Jamara family are were at that time, I'm not sure today, the largest grape growers in the United States. Jamara had vineyards, packing houses, trucking companies of their own to move grapes throughout the state and to other states. So they didn't pay middlemen for anything, and they're really huge. I also inspected later in the 70s when I became a U.S. federal inspector for the Department of Agriculture. I inspected at Jamara, and I ran into John Jamara Jr. He said, "I haven't seen you since we signed those contracts back in the 70s. And the first thing is, how's your dad? And every place I went to, a lot of them we had worked at years earlier. And I'd go and meet the grower, whoever's in charge of the company. I'm the inspector for the day. And the shock on their faces. So one of them had known me so long in Delano when we were at Lucas, he was an inspector. He says, "Johnny, how are you?" And I know when you call me Johnny, you must have known me when I was very young. And I said, "I'm fine." He goes, "How's your dad?" And all this. And of course, one of the next questions is, "Are you going to be straight with us today, or do we have to worry about something?" Being an ex-striker, how am I going to treat them? And I treated them the way they wanted to. So just followed along.
So when Larry resigned, I mean, what was your reaction? Did you view him as an icon that you?
I remember people talking to Larry not to.
Okay.
I remember them going to him. I don't know who all went, but I understand a number of the manongs, a number of people that were in leadership went. Larry wasn't the only one that had the same concerns. A lot of them had the same concerns Larry had about things that were going on within the union.
How the Filipino manongs were being treated.
Right, and what was going on since the strike ended, and we had contracts and concerns regarding how the carry halls were done. And I think that was kind of a symbolic event in terms of how we saw things that might continue to occur, that might be hampering us or neglecting us, I think would be a better word. But to lose Larry from that process when he's at the top, means now we don't have a voice at the top, and now we have to. And that's when Pete came in, and in effect replaced him. But there's each person that's involved in an organization like this has their own dynamic, and Larry has a dynamic different than my dad, different than Philip, different than Ben Gines, different than Pete, or different than Philip. So to lose somebody like that is not a good thing. And he was missed because he's always going to be very vocal and open and very straightforward. He's one of those persons that taught me growing up that if something's really very essential that you're dealing with, be very straightforward. Don't hem and haw and play around with it. And he was always very direct, and I really like that about him as an individual, because Filipinos tend to guard our words more a lot of times when we really should be more straightforward with our words than we are, because we're always concerned about the other person's response and how they would feel. I don't think Larry was always that concerned about that. His perspective was, this is a life and death struggle, and we don't have time to play around with how everybody feels all the time. This is what we need, and this is what it is. So I think for a lot of us young Filipinos, we learned some dynamics from Larry that we might not have learned otherwise. And we learned things from Philip that we wouldn't have learned otherwise. And he's kind of one of those very rare persons. I was shocked when it happened because I wasn't aware that it was going to happen. And they're always having meetings. By the way, through this entire period of active involvement in the union, my parents were involved from 65, and Mom died in 75. My dad was still involved with the union up until the time he stopped working entirely in the late 70s and early 80s. And my dad's perspective was, he didn't agree, but there were still Filipinos involved with the union, and somebody from the old time still needed to be in contact because we were one of the few families that could say, we were here before Cesar. We were here before whatever. We knew everybody. I mean, and sometimes it's the dynamics of those relationships over the long haul that are important as well. During the strike and even after the strike, when things were going on in the Arvin area, with sweetheart contracts were signed with the Teamsters to undercut us, and they had further negotiations, and then we picketed them because those were sweetheart contracts. Those were not full contracts with the workers. And that's when, in the video that I showed, where they were coming down the road with sticks to attack our picketers, right? Well, at that point, La Paz was already the headquarters. And during the strike still, people up there earning $5 a week and still living off of donated food. This is in the 70s. This is 10 years since the strike began. So they're still trying to live on very little. So we would go in Arvin at the time before that strike in Arvin took place. We'd go buy the week's groceries for the camp, and then we would buy extra groceries, my dad and mom would, a couple extra boxes of food, vegetables, and sugar, and all kinds of things, and drive up to La Paz and give them the food, years later, because this whole process was still ongoing. And, but, carrying on Larry's legacy of standing up, which I think is one of the great things he was always telling us to do. If you're willing to sacrifice, then stand up for yourself. What are you fearing? This is this is America. We have rights here. We have legal rights here. You're not here to step on anyone's toes, but you have rights to stand up for the things that are necessary that you deserve to be able to get, based on your work. Right? And I remember being at the Fresno convention when Blas came, representing the government of the Philippines, to the union. We were all, to use the word, we were all pissed off. We had talked in our house with my dad and Philip and Debbie Volmer and others, put Pete in a very difficult place in the union because he's already vice president, and as much as others in the union, some people favored Cesar to go, and we were against him because it said something we didn't want said about our union. We may be a small component, but it's still our union going to the Philippines and accepting an award from Marcos. Right? So it was decided among that he would go, but we went to the convention, and when Blas stood up, we all stood up in the convention and turned our backs to it. That didn't go over very well. And to be honest with you, other than being on the boycott, which I was in San Diego while I was in college in the 70s, I really paid a lot of attention to my grades. It was kind of one of those things that, yeah, you can go be part of the boycott. Yeah, you can go do this. Yeah, you can be in the band. But your grades won't suffer. They need, that's the sort of tradition that I got from my parents. It was one of those moments in my college years where, again, I stood up and did this demonstration, political demonstration. It was another event. The strike was an event, and other things we had done. But I remember standing there facing this crowd of workers. My dad's over here, Philip's over there. Philip had left the days. They wouldn't let Philip talk. Debbie was over here. And us standing up and these people telling us to sit down. Like we were disrespecting Blas. We're saying, do you know who this guy is? That son of a bitch up on the stage. And my dad, we had a relative in the Philippines that was in prison.
He was detained?
Yeah. And my dad was telling people behind us, we have family in prison in the Philippines because of people like this. And they were going, really? So, not everyone understood the dynamics. But it was one of those chances where we really need to make our positions felt.
But, how has this grape strike and the establishment of your government, you were in such a thing, you were a teenager then, so you sort of how has it affected your life and of your family's relationship and the way you look at things.
My family meaning my personal family?
Yeah, I'm saying that this grape strike is a very, very strong movement. It started out, but the way, looking back, it has what sort of like values, like even the way Larry Itliong is as a leader of the manongs. How has it changed or inculcated something in your life that you value up to now when you're old?
In a lot of different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And it started when I was very young.
Yeah.
It became apparent to me from what Larry was saying and others, including Philip, for example, that America is a land of opportunity, but you have to make something of that opportunity. Okay? And I remember them talking about, well, this is part of that. Walter Ruth, the president of the United Auto Workers, came to the Filipino community. There was a bunch of press around him when he came to visit. I was doing homework, seated on the side of the hall, when they were talking, and he turned to me by pure chance. It just wasn't coordinated. I was just sitting there doing homework, and he turns to me and says, well, why don't you ask him? And I didn't know what they'd asked him, and I looked up, and he said, young man, what's your name? And I told him my name, and he said, they want to ask you a question. And he says, well, why are you doing this strike? Why is this strike important to you? So, in a way of answering your question, I'm going to tell you what I said to Walter Reuther in front of the press. I said, we need this strike so that I will have an opportunity someday to be able to afford to be able to go to college and finish. For a little kid, that may seem like a very mature thing to say, but I've been hearing that my entire life from all the manongs. Go to school, finish your education. All of them. Larry and Philip, my parents, my manongs. So one of the things that came out of this was we're willing to put ourselves on the line to make things better. So when you have your chance to leave and go, what are you going to do? Settle for any job that comes your way, or are you going to tough it out? Or are you going to work at it? So I decided really very quickly that after I left the seminary, once I came home, that I was going to go to college and finish my degrees. Obviously, part of that comes from your own personal effort and intention to do the work. But the focus of how you go about doing that usually comes from somebody behind you and older than you. And that comes from Larry and Philip and my parents and the manongs.
Like sort of like the determination or something.
Well, I had a lot of friends that I knew that I started college with, and not all was finished. And some got married, some left, some got jobs, and some just quit. And when you see that happening, and you realize what you're coming from, some of them from Delano too, it sometimes makes you say, I have to finish this. Because why did they come here? Did they come to America so that I would go to college and spend a semester and then decide, no, I'll just go do something else? Or I'm bedazzled by this girl, and she's more important in school, and then you get married, have 3 kids, and quit. They come to America because those things you can do in the Philippines, right? So I said, there has to be something more than that. I have to do something to say thank you. And I was fortunate enough for Philip and my dad to be old enough to come to my graduations and be able to thank them and be able to show them that. But since they passed, in my second career now as a lawyer, and I do insurance defense and workers' compensation is one of the areas I work in. But I have had a couple of cases in my career for workers. One of them is a football player, a pro football player case, a friend of mine. I took his case through the workers' compensation area. But all of my other cases have been for the employer. And one might say, how can you do that, having come from the union? Well, defense lawyers also need to be aware and capable when somebody has an injury that should be picked up as a claim and paid benefits on. I have the power to push to get that done. Where somebody might not have a claim and they're playing the system, I don't want to pay that claim. It's costing all of us a bunch of money for somebody who really is not injured and is trying to make a claim that isn't there. So there's ways in which one seeks their career to do good things for people in different ways. And so that's what I decided to do. But I've made some good friends that are some attorneys I know from Delano that I work with, and others. And then I've raised my family. We were able to meet my son this afternoon, who works at Disneyland as a dinner chef. And he learned to cook from me, and I learned to cook from the manongs. So some of the techniques he uses at Disneyland about how to tell whether that is just the right way to be prepared like a steak comes from his skills in cooking certain foods come from a camp in Delano, California. And there are a lot of manongs and Filipinos that were ex-Navy cooks who became chefs at major restaurants in the United States that people don't really think about anymore, like the Brown Derby had Filipino chefs that were ex-Navy cooks. Well, it's kind of to thank them too, because they came to America and they did something very special for us. But they're not recognized very much either. But it's to let people know that we're here to do something good for everyone else. So my son, who looks very American, being 1/4 Filipino, meets Filipino chefs who are at Disneyland, and he has to convince them, not only am I Filipino, but my dad's, my grandpa's Ilocano, and we came from the vineyards in Delano, and they all have heard about Delano. So he makes that connection so that Filipino spirit continues on to the next generation. So in that sense, I really have made it important in my life to make sure that the following generation knows that we did not get off a boat or an airplane in New York or whatever. We got off a boat in 1928 as founders, and to be proud of that. So that's kind of how it's affected. I'll tell you about the beginning of the march. This brings in Robert Kennedy. The march in 1966 was really undertaken to wake up, the general public and to show who we were in more than just picketing. I mean, picketing is kind of a local event, but we wanted something that would talk to the rest of the state, if not the country. And so we decided to do a march to Sacramento as a union for our rights. And so we began in Delano, and as I recall, we were out at, we didn't have the village at this point. We were out at Albany near the cemetery at a small place called the Pink House, and we were marching from there over to the Filipino Hall, and then from the Filipino Hall we would march through town and heading north out of Delano to eventually reach Sacramento. And as we were marching through town, there was a police cordon that went across the road to stop us. As I recall, there was some indication of either not having a permit to march through town or an improper permit or something of that sort. And so they stopped us, and so we did what we always did when we were confronted with things like that. We knelt to pray. And so we didn't throw any rocks, and we didn't yell at the police, and we didn't assault anyone or do anything like that. And the press was there. My understanding is the phone call was made somewhat quickly from the union to Washington, D.C. And with connections that we had at some point, I believe it was through Robert Kennedy's office. He was a senator, I believe, at this point, not serving as the Attorney General. And that evidently phone calls were made, and a phone call was made back to the city of Delano advising them from the governmental agency, it could have been the Attorney General's office, to remove the cordon across the street and in effect, it would be good to assist us in marching through Delano. So we marched through Delano, and the strike to the walk to Sacramento began. I don't remember what the day of the week was, but I remember being in that march for at least part of it. But those of us who were in school, I had to go back to town, so somebody would have driven the kids, including me, back to Delano. And I went back to school for the week, and it took weeks and weeks to get to Sacramento because we're walking. We'd stop in parks along the way. And there's a central highway that goes to California, both the 5 and the 99. You can't use those to go marching through the state. So we went northeast of town and went on county roads, okay, through other towns. And we would stop in city parks and in churches and places and camp out overnight. And people would bring food and we'd have food and some kind of accommodation. And then the next morning, get up and start marching. And by the time we got to Sacramento, from what I remember, there were thousands upon thousands of people that had joined this march. Students, other farm workers from up and down the state, people who had come to learn about what we were doing and wanted to be part of it. And I remember when we turned in Sacramento, that street that comes up to the Capitol building itself, that street was packed from building to building, the entire street and sidewalk with blocks of people. And I remember for the first time in my life, realizing, that I had a picket sign, a flag. And I remember getting sort of lost from the group, because there's the Delano group, and then there's everybody coming to, and I'm still this 12, 13-year-old kid, and I got lost. I was sort of in the crowd somewhere, and I heard somebody yell, my name, Johnny. And somebody's looking for Johnny. As people are concerned, I yelled, it's me. And people were sort of pushing me forward to get back to where I belong. And I remember this lady saying, are you okay? And I said, yeah, I just got lost. She said, where are you from? I said, I'm from Delano. And this lady looked at me and said, wow, you marched all the way from Delano. And we got separated. And I realized at that point, this was something much bigger than Delano. That this was something that was going on the press and was going to wind up being sort of worldwide.
Can you give us some water, Bill? Yeah, can you give us some water?
We had also heard
You gotta take a drink, John.
that the effect of our nonviolent response to things was effective. That they had, it brought a lot of respect to us. We called during this time there was the anti-war movement and other things were going on, which were not always nonviolent. Sometimes they were. We decided that we weren't going to do that. And so I think that brings a lot of respect when you can say to somebody, yeah, you can harm me if you want, but I'm not going to do that to you. And that's something that's affected me my entire life. I don't attack people or argue with them unnecessarily. I don't attack them, but I don't argue with people unnecessarily unless I have to make an argument, of course, as a lawyer. Because people deserve respect. And that came from not only the community, but that process we were in the union. The other thing it taught me, and this comes partly from the Masonic tradition of the Gran Oriente, and the union, and the elders, Larry and the other moms. And I taught this to my son. As you go through life, don't cut the cords that connect you with people, and don't destroy the bridges that you have as you go forward, leaving things broken in your path, because that's not what life's about. And consequently, at the Filipino 50th anniversary we just had in Delano, one of the growers, Jack Pamela, provided grapes for us to use on the tables to remind everyone coming for the 50th anniversary of a strike of the grapes that were involved in that process, and that's a donation from a grower. And I've known Jackie Pamela since we were both at St. Mary's as little kids. We served as altar boys together. And I've never cut my ties and cut my relationships with people, even though I'm a striker's kid, and a farm worker, and he's a grower's son. Why should I destroy a relationship? So I talked to him recently about some things. And Alex Edilor, of the Filipino American National Historical Society, said he talked to Jackie a week or so ago, and Jackie got him some grapes. Well, that comes out of respect. And I think what we're doing here for Larry in this film, we're doing this out of love and respect for somebody that was just one of the most dynamic leaders in the Filipino community in the history of the United States. And there's a reason that schools and bridges and monuments are being placed in his and Philip and others' names. It's because we want to forget. And when you give your life and everything about you and sacrifice things for the good of people in general, workers in general, and then people, we can't afford to forget that. So, what are we doing there? We're building a bridge, and we're connecting relationships between Larry and his generation and us and our children and the following generations. And that's what's really important, because I had a cousin that came from the Philippines about 18 years ago. And of course he didn't know anything about the strike, he didn't know anything that had gone on before. And I remember we spent a lot of time one evening over a couple of glasses of wine and a long, wonderful discussion. And at the end of it, he said he'd heard about Mang Bob, my dad, but he said, I had no idea that Filipinos had done these things in the United States. And I said, yeah, it's because we weren't able to tell the story. And telling the story and having a film and having a book, as professors are now writing, means that the succeeding generations will have the resources to know. Because if we don't tell the stories now, and if we don't write the books now, it's over. We can't wait too long, because we don't have the kind of archive and documentation. We don't have the first level resources to be able to preserve that. And it's a lot of the research, like with you going back to all the publications and journalistic work that's been done, that gives you a journalist or historian's perspective on a issue at a particular time, like a snapshot. But does it tell you everything about Larry? I don't think so. Does it tell you everything about Philip? I don't think so. And coming home from college, political science and economics was my major. And sitting in Alberta Village and talking with Philip and discussing Stalin, Dostoevsky, Plato, Socrates. It might come to surprise somebody that a manong who worked in the fields and washed dishes in kitchens and sit down and talk to you about Socrates. He's probably one of the most well-read persons I've ever known in my life. And for me to be able to have had him in my life as long as I did and cherish that relationship is an example of, I think, in many ways, how manongs like Larry and others have affected us. I wish deeply in my heart, and every time I see Johnny, I wish not only for his family, but for the rest of us that Larry had lived longer, to be able to give us more background and history and his thoughts. Because there are a few people in this country, as Filipinos, who put their imprint on our lives. It may seem like it's only labor law. It's the entire fabric of our people. When Filipino young people today, and I talk with them, and I tell them, don't fear, don't worry about, well, if I do this, somebody might think. I said, if you're being cordial and kind and forthright and honest and truthful, and the reason for doing something is to make something better, it'll be accepted. And don't worry about what everyone's going to think. Write or do whatever it is you're going to do. Whatever field of endeavor you think is your natural field of endeavor, go for it. You're going to be the next artist or architect or engineer or surgeon or lawyer or whatever in your field that will do something very dynamic. Because we have that in our people. It's one of the things about, I think, Filipinos as a people is that education has always been very, very, very important. And for young people that will watch this film, if there's anything I would tell them that Larry would say, stand up for yourself. And don't worry about Is everyone going to think this and that? Just do the right thing in your life, follow your morals the way they should be followed, and stand up and do the things and accomplish those things in your life you need to do. And if somebody else next to you needs your help, don't sit back. Go up to them and say, as Filipinos often do, can I help you? You know, do you need me? And you'll find that you'll accomplish a lot. You know? So, in essence, no, I don't remember about Larry running for the city council. But I don't know if Larry could have gotten elected to anything in the United States at any position at that point. Because this is 1966. So, Delano, nonetheless, I think like Debbie Vollmer ran for city council in Bakersfield some years later. And she had a difficulty because everyone remembers she was one of the attorneys for the United Farm Workers. So your history will follow you. But if your history is one that's good, then you don't have anything to fear. And Larry's one of those that I think in the long run people are going to realize, especially after Johnny gets done with all of the work he's doing for his dad, document-wise and documentary-wise, I think people will realize that we've had this wonderful man that was in our midst. And you know what's really funny? I don't even remember Larry having 7 fingers. I know everyone remembers him having only 7 fingers. And I think one of the reasons my dad had 9 fingers. So not having all your fingers was not something that was sort of like important to me. And so I never really paid attention to his hands. And so every time somebody brings that up, I go, oh yeah, now I remember that. But it didn't seem, what always seemed amazing to me was his look. He would have a beard at some point, and then a goatee at some point, and then a mustache at some point. And I remember at the signing of the contract, here's these growers in nice white dress shirts, slacks. Here's Cesar, and if I recall correctly, Cesar's either wearing a traditional Mexican shirt or a barong Tagalog. But it's one of the two, and they look somewhat similar to each other. And Larry's wearing this plaid shirt with an old cowboy hat, kind of this old Western hat. And I thought, there goes Larry again. You know, it's like, okay, well, I'm just going to stand out a little bit beyond my own here. You know, and I thought, it's just him. You know, he had his own manner and his own style. He was very unique, and I miss him a lot.
You mentioned having wonderful conversation with Philip. So part of the stuff that I found online is declassified FBI files. It was on UFW, Cesar Chavez, but there was one specific one was on the communist infiltration of the farm worker movement, and then also at some point the Birch Society published something about calling Larry a communist, and then Larry ended up suing them for $2 million for libel. Do you recall anything related to that?
Well, you know, I don't remember the Birch Society and a lawsuit against Larry, but from the very first day this whole thing started, in Delano, among the established businesses and what have you, communism was the first thing that came out of everybody's mouth. You know, part of the fact is that there is a known long-standing history of Filipino labor work, you know, strikes, and everybody that knows history and has read well knows that there are, you know, some underpinnings in the past among a lot of union organizing in various places in the United States that had connections to, you know, either, you know, the American Communist Party, communists or socialists. What always struck me about that with our union, I didn't see that. Because knowing what I know now after having studied Russia and China in school, in political science, communism is this commune-like existence and relationship among people and businesses and organizations and ownership of control in a country, if not a society. Other than the fact that people were eating out of a common kitchen with contributed food and earning $5 a week because we didn't have much money, there wasn't anything else about what we did that was leaning socialist or communist at all. I mean, how do you do that when every day you have Mass with praise of God? And we had rabbis, and we had priests, and we had pastors that were involved with our organization or union all the way along. Because one of the tenets of socialism, to some degree, but communism for sure, is that man is of the highest order. There is no God. You are God. You are the highest level of attainment in society that can ever be. Well, that's not the way we were. That's, when we knelt down, when we were being assaulted, we prayed. Communists don't do that. Socialists don't do it either, we understand. We prayed to God. And it's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Bible. So, yeah, I heard that. And all of us inside. And I went off to go to the seminary, right, to be a priest. I heard that we all went, are you nuts? We all want to go home, and then all of a sudden, what do all the kids wind up being out of Delano? We're not a bunch of socialists. We've got architects and engineers and doctors and some attorneys and others. And we're all in private business or doing something. So what came out of that, as you asked earlier, how did it affect you, is what came out of being in a union for all of us that were the kids. We went off and got college degrees and went on with our lives in private business and doing work. So I think it's one of those common things that comes out whenever you have a labor problem. The first thing everyone falls to is it's got to be communist or whatever. And there may have been some of that in the past, but I really didn't see it in our union.
So, you were involved with the San Diego boycott.
Yes, in San Diego State.
Can you describe, because like Larry Itliong, they went all over the place. You hear news reports. They would go here and there, and so what was that like?
Well, I did it in San Diego because that's where I'm going to college, which goes back to the traditional Filipino parental advisement: finish your grades, do your work. So I'm not going on the boycott in New York or anywhere else. It's close to my campus.
What year?
1972.
Oh.
So when you're doing this, you're doing it locally, and you're doing it when you can get away from school and your papers are done, right? Saturdays. And there was a boycott already that had been instituted in San Diego through labor associations that were already facilitating that with some union representation. So I helped together with students, help bring students to the boycott from campus. And there were a lot of Mexican and Asian students involved in that. And the fun part would be to get in front of students and go, we want you to go on this boycott, we're going down to this store, this store, and this store on Saturday, and let me tell you why. And to stand up and say, I'm from Delano, and my family was part of the strike and the boycott to begin with, and this is what it was like in the fields, was really, really great. Because for the first time away from home, I wasn't talking to people I knew. I was talking for the most part to strangers and students I didn't know, but I was telling them our story. The Filipino story, the camp story, the union story, the AWOC story, the UFW story, all of that. To sort of give them context. Why are we doing this? Why are we asking you to give up your day? And why is this important? How will this affect what we're doing there? And you would see people, you wouldn't normally see on picket lines or boycotts there. Your wealthier white student, or whatever major they were. We got a lot of students from all across the spectrum. And it was really, really kind of a wonderful time because I got to stay involved and do what I needed to do. Otherwise, that
What do you think were their challenges in the boycott? Because they started the boycott in '66, right? And then so it went all the way until 1970. Like for you, it's your personal experience in running a boycott. What were the biggest challenge?
For me, running a boycott wasn't wasn't hard because I was just a student assisting the organizers who had actually organized the boycott. The hard part in organizing a boycott is not only your affiliations and associations with organizations that would bring out their members locally to begin doing the boycott with you, but it's to get the correct public relations going and press so that they were aware of what you're doing and why you were doing it. And there are times when, leaders would be there. Larry would be there, Philip would be there, or Cesar would go across the country. But the difficult thing for some is that even some of the manongs that went off on the boycott, they had never even traveled to some of these cities before, ever in their life. And sometimes you're doing this in the middle of winter, so it's like cold and wet and icy. And they're heading up and working on boycotts and things and organizing a huge process. And they were never really completely trained to do that. And so part of it's shooting from the hip, and part of it's goodwill, and part of it's the fact that there are other union and labor people who are more than willing to come in and assist and to talk to their members. And it tends to steamroll to some degree. If you can get the right people involved, and you've spoken to the right organizations, and you need permits to picket, and all that has to be done. But yeah, the hard part is really getting it set up because you're just a cog of the union, leaving to go to an entirely new place. Or the only thing anyone ever there has ever heard about Delano is if they looked at a label on a box for some reason in the past when they bought grapes. Other than that, nobody's ever heard of Delano. It's not a place you would visit for a summer vacation. It's just a place for grapes. So you really have to. They really had to struggle in the beginning to really work hard to get that going. But once it was started, and especially overseas, when we had boycotts in Europe, Europe is highly organized. Labor is highly organized. So when they heard somebody was coming, they were almost falling over themselves to want to come and help because it was something they'd heard about. And it was hard there too because now we have language and other issues that we're dealing with. But once the boycotts started, it's probably one of the major factors that we're able to bring the doors to the table.
That's it.
So there was this one documentary where Larry was talking, and this was after he left, and so he was talking about, he founded or was the president of the FAPA, and he was talking about the political representation. What were your thoughts about that? Because that's what he was advocating for, Filipino American political recognition, I guess. And that's why he joined the Democratic National Convention. Do you recall anything about that, or what?
I remember him getting involved with the Democratic Party on a more active basis, and then organizations like FAPA. But as I recall, those are really very strong and positive things because, for example, the Filipino community building itself in Delano was founded as the, I may be a little off in this title, but I'm trying to remember as much of it as I can. It was like the Filipino Current Tulare County Taxpayers Association. Yeah. It was an association of people in the communities who were here living and had houses and were paying taxes. And they did that because they were trying to get people to realize you're here, you're part of these communities, and you're doing the normal process of living and paying taxes and mortgage and all that other stuff. But there's a part of your life that's missing, and that's community involvement and politics, voting. And so I think FAPA and other organizations comes out of that same community mindset that you can literally come here, buy a house, get a job, retire, raise a family, and never vote, never join a party, and perhaps if you have a green card, never become a citizen either, to be able to vote. And you're missing out on a whole lot of what America's all about. You have this right that people for 200 years died for. When King George III was in control of the United States, nobody voted in America about a tax. The whole thing was we were being taxed in an unrepresented fashion. We wanted that out. We couldn't vote it out, so we revolted. Well, then we put in our own government, and we decided that we could vote, and who could vote, and eventually that's been expanded over time with various changes. At the time we grew up in the 50s, now my dad became a citizen in the mid-50s and began voting immediately. I went to vote with my dad in Delano. I shouldn't say that I was living away, but I went to drive my dad to vote in Delano up until the year before he died. He died in '86. So I think, like Filipino Community of Delano and many other associations and organizations around the state and other parts of the United States, FAPA is a natural outgrowth of a national organization to seek to do what other leaders have been talking about for a long time. The Filipinos need to become an essential, everyday, normal part of the electoral process by being elected and voting and being part of their governmental institutions. You know, Mark Polito's city councilman now and mayor of Cerritos. At one point, he was just a kid from UCLA going to visit the manongs, right? And then Larry and Philip were part of that whole process of getting, you know, Mark to think, you can run. You should think of running. That's probably a really good step for you, knowing who you are. And he has. And he's been involved in government, various positions in government before he ran for elected office. I've never run for office, but I was involved in another career before I was a lawyer. I was assistant to the city manager in Lancaster. I was assistant to the sheriff of Kings County, and assistant to the community development director for the city of San Clemente. So a lot of Filipinos have gotten involved with things, but it's the community that needs to also realize your voice needs to be heard. And the way you do that is go to the polling place all the time and vote your conscience and what your heart tells you is correct. So FAPA is what it means, Filipino American Political Association. It doesn't direct itself to one party, it doesn't direct itself to one issue. But I think the long-range goal is to get Filipinos to become active.
Chinatown.
Oh,
It's
Money
all
making.
wiped out now. But what do you recall? Like, you know, their stories are like the manongs would hang out over there, but now it's totally wiped out.
Okay,
This is San Francisco.
Chinatown is
Yeah.
Delano,
Yeah,
Chinatown in
Oh,
Delano.
Chinatown.
No, they had card rooms.
Oh, card
Card
rooms.
rooms. Chinatown in Delano was about 3 blocks long and about 1 full block wide. It had everything from clothing stores to card rooms to the best Chinese food in Central California called the Pagoda that the Wong family owned, and I went to school with Susan Wong. And they served Chinese food when it was still served on an aluminum dish that was like this with a little
Yeah.
tray on top,
Oh,
the way they used to serve them. Excellent, excellent food. Their duck was superb. But next to that was Buddy's place. Buddy Gonzalez was our neighbor next door to us, 15th Avenue and Clinton Street. Buddy and Matha, who's also an American wife, owned Buddy's place. If you didn't live in a camp, but you wanted great Filipino food or a great rib steak, you went to Buddy's place. And they had a long counter and a few tables. And it was like eating at home, except you had to pay a little bit. Music, just great atmosphere. And to me, if I were ever to go in the restaurant business and want to build something that was like essentially Filipino, I'd build a Buddy's place again and name it after Buddy Gonzalez. And then there were card rooms, and people went in there and they played Alarasi and Rummy and card games, and technically against each other. House would take a cut because you're using their table.
It's like a pong.
I don't really know what other games might be played in the back room,
Mahjong.
but there were other games played in the back room. And if you weren't really very astute, you could lose your entire payday. You know, you come in with your pocket full and you go home and it's empty. So you had to be kind of astute as to how they went. And I got to be honest with you. You know, we had in our camp, we had a card room, which we had 3 card tables with an air conditioner, a swamp cooler, and a ping pong table. The ping pong table was for the young Pinoys, and the 3 card tables were for the manongs. And my dad used to tell the young guys, you know, should I play? And my dad would say, not if you want to keep your wallet. So they've been playing cards for 40 years. You'll start off thinking you're winning, and they'll let you win, and they'll let you put more money in until it's all there, and go on. And so that was kind of in town, and it was away, and then they had, you know, alcohol and beer and what have you. But the young guys like me, I didn't do it very much, but once in a while, if I kind of really needed money for something I was doing, we all kind of built our own shoe boxes with a little foot stand on it, a clip on the side, and inside you had brown shoe wax and black shoe wax and brushes and shining cloth. And you go down there, and for 25 cents, you'd shine somebody's shoes. And so they could look pretty good. And so Saturday night, you know, we do that too. And then there was also the social arrangements.
Dance halls.
Dance halls,
Yeah.
10 cents a dance. We had one in Chinatown that I remember. I don't remember the name of it, but I know places like Stockton had really large dance halls. We really didn't have that. We had dancing at the Filipino community. I don't remember in my lifetime. It may have been because who might have known, but I remember we had a lot of dances. But I don't think you paid anyone to dance. It was just social dancing. But it was kind of like your smaller version of a big town Chinatown. So we were a small community. Down the street from there is a building that's still on Glenwood, on the other side of 11th Avenue, is a kind of a brown reddish brick bar on a corner that was called the Cuckoo Inn.
I went
by
there.
Andrew Escalante.
Yeah,
It's called. It has a different name now, but when I went inside, and yeah, they kind of I think renovated the place, but I went in there, you know, had some beer and stuff, and it's right beside the rail tracks, and I'm like, when is the train coming? And then soon enough, it came.
Well, you know, in Delano, you either had 1 or 2 things to wake up in the morning, which was never an alarm clock. It was an early morning freight train, where all the Filipino roosters in town all waking up at the same time. And we had roosters, a few in our backyard, but Buddy, who owned Buddy's place, that was our neighbor, they lived in town because that was his restaurant. They had like 30 chicken coops, so every morning they all wake up and then you wake up. But I remember if you really wanted to have a good time, people would wait till they got a little time and on vacation to go to Stockton or Sacramento or San Francisco, spend some time with family, and go to the dance halls. But that whole area was started by the Chinese initially, because before the Filipinos came after the turn of the last century, the Chinese came first, and we had Japanese come, and then of course the Filipino to the Central Valley. Next block down from Chinatown, where you could usually go get your brakes fixed, was the Yanaki brothers. I went to school with Dennis, a Japanese family. And they've had that, I don't know if they own it now, but they had it all the time I was there. And so they are an old Japanese family that one time were in farm work and then bought a piece of land, and somebody was good at mechanics and had a gas station. Takaki, Japanese farm assistant, you know. So there had been a long historical previous group of Japanese. And what's amazing is, although during the World War II there were difficulties with camps and all that, I don't remember, even after the war, Filipinos and Japanese having a difficulty at all among all of us. But these Japanese families have been in the United States, I don't know, by this point, 70 years, 60 years, multiple generations. And we'd all been together and farmed together. My dad used to be a tomato farmer in Porterville, a Japanese tomato farmer. So there were these long relationships too. But yeah, I guess to me, when you say Chinatown, I think money making quarter at a time.
I went to downtown Main Street, and I saw two rundown, not working anymore theaters. Was that operating back
Oh,
in
yeah.
the 60s? And did the manongs, go there, watch movies, or like stroll down Main Street? Because it's totally changed
Yeah,
now.
manongs didn't typically go to movies in town. The movies were typically just American films, and so we didn't have a theater that showed Filipino movies, so that would have been of more interest to them. And going to a movie was just not something they typically did at the end of their week. But those theaters, were running and were very active. And the Sierra Theater, which is the larger of the two, it's a beautiful theater inside. It's all got inlaid floors and what have you. And the only thing I remember about the Delano Theater, which is the smaller of the two that's actually on Main Street, before my time, if you were Mexican or Filipino, you were up in the second, the balcony. And if you were Caucasian, you were down in the first one. So there was some segregation, as we were in those days, but at some point that all just sort of stopped. One thing that was apparent to me, this even before I went to school in Delano, back in the early 60s and late 50s, once young Filipinos were growing up and going to school in Delano, Filipinos made it a habit of being valedictorian of the high school. And that was a really positive, but I think effective way of making a statement in the community. We live on the wrong side of the tracks. We work in the vineyards, but we study harder than everybody else does. And then we go off and do what we need to do. So we use the theater all the time. And we all went to the movies. We used to have a drive-in theater outside of Delano. And it was really a lot of fun because then you could go and hang out with your buddies and drink a beer that you weren't supposed to bring to the theater. Not tell your parents about. Yeah.
So now it's all changed. Do you know what happened? Like, I can't see any traces of white, Caucasian, European. It's all Mexican thing in Main Street now.
Population growth. Immigration and population growth. Most of the farm workers are Mexican American, right? Immigrant workers. When you have a large population growth like that, and you're going to have a need for businesses related to needs of a particular community, and that all changes from what was primarily American businesses to Mexican business owners. But at one time, except for Nasing Escalona's dress shop, which was in Delano at the corner of 11th and Main Street, they sold really, really nice dresses in her store. I can't really think of any other stores on Main Street that were not white. But they were built. I mean, Delano was built by Caucasians. We had farm work, but the businesses and the establishment had always been there. But it's gone through this change because I think the community has changed in terms of populations. At one time, as I recall, until Leonard Velasco became a council person, all of the council members were a few Mexican. I remember Mr. Frank Herrera was a city councilman before the strike, but all of the members of the city council typically had been Caucasian. And now I think there's a large percentage of Mexican population that are on the council of Delano. So Delano's gone through its own process of change, and it's not. Like any city, will go through that. And it's not the same city it was in the 60s or 50s as it is now. Chinatown's gone, so until we can put something up that will remember that location, no one will remember it's there except if you went there as played cards or you shined at people shine shoes. So the difficulty is that you tend to lose your history. which you do what is now being done with the Filipino community.